I know next to nothing about urban Ghana, so maybe I'm demonstrating my ignorance. I'm somewhat puzzled by your use of the word landlord. To me, a landlord is somebody who lets either a house or a room or a plot of land. What you're describing sounds more like they are sellers of land, unless they're like the Duke of Westminster, who has leasehold property and lets it out, but it will revert to him in 100 years' time, and it's getting ground rent. Now, if they are actually sellers of land, albeit illegally, they shouldn't be called landlords, in my opinion. Now, what I'm really getting at, in Latin America, these people exist. They either lay land invasions or they sell lands, as in Bogota. But they don't actually have much power. They're intermediaries with the people who do have power, the councillors, the people who provide water and sewage and so on. But as soon as they have acquired water and electricity, they basically lose their power. And as they've sold the land, they have no influence there either. So I'm somewhat puzzled as to why these leaders maintain their power. In Bogota, for example, occasionally these people would get onto the council, but they're equally likely to be locked up. And they'll never become mayor, and they very rarely become councillors. So I realise you probably don't know anything about Bogota or Latin America, but why the difference?
Well, thank you for the question. And one of the points of this project is to break down the categories that we think we know about. So your work has done a good job of breaking down the concept of the word slum. And what I use that term for objective reasons, but I'm trying to break it down to what do these communities actually look like. So I use terms like indigenous settlements, terms like extra-legal settlements as a way to break down the concept slums. And I think the word landlord also needs to be broken down, because what you see is the control of property is different across these different settlement patterns. And that's a key part of what I try to do in my project and in my broader work. So in an area like Old Fadama, which is an extra-legal settlement, there are customary authorities who claim certain ownership over that property. Then there are custodians of that land from a certain family, and these are Ga people, because it's the Ga indigenous territory in Old Fadama. And then there are people who settled over time and established certain relationships with some of those authorities, and then now there are so many people living there that they're able to control land. So they act as kind of de facto landlords in this particular area.
But are they selling the land? Are they selling plots of land?
They're not. Some of them they'll sell the area, and someone will put up their kiosk. There is no property title. So if that's what you mean by selling.
Yeah.
Do you want to add, sir?
Well, yeah, I think that I come from Accra.
Mm-hmm.
I come from Jamestown. I've lived in Lagos town. And the issues that you've thrown up are fairly real.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that in order to understand them, you need to go further back, way before Rawlins. When Nkrumah was overthrown, Rawlins was in Form 5 secondary school doing his GCSEs like me. But the things that had happened before them, and I think that the major problem we face in the creation of slums in Ghana and in Accra is the fact that we had the military intervene in our governance. And that military intervention still carries over. Because, for instance, what you described at the local level, there's no party politics. There's no party politics at ward level. There's only party politics at constituency level. And that was specifically brought in when Rawlins was transferring power to ensure that they at the top would always control people at the bottom. So one of the things that we need to do in our constitution, 1992 constitution, is to go back and ensure that we have party politics at the local level so that the people will elect their own representatives. not have government representatives. Now, in the absence of party politics in the local level, anybody else can become a boss. But I'm just worried about your mention of chiefs within Accra, because if you look at Ashiaman and Old Fadama, I don't see the influence of any chiefs, because the chiefs are indigenous Ghana people. And the creation of Ashiaman was because Ashiaman came after the 1966 coup, because Nkrumah built a township. And after 1966, there were no more buildings. So people started settling in shanty towns. Old Fadama came in 1983 because there were fights up in the north, and Rawlings conveniently said, let's bring these people to Accra so that the fights will end, right? There was some development planning in Accra during my time as a young boy in the 50s and the 60s. When you talk about the open sewers, we used to clean the sewers ourselves. We did not need any councillor or any bossman to tell us, because you clean in front of your house, somebody else cleans, goes on, and then somebody else cleans. It was when Rawlings came, or when the military came initially, that all this thing about people staying back and not getting involved in the politics of their local area started happening. Now, let's look at how the slums were created, because I think that's very important. Growing up, the first building was the first development building was a place called Amamumu, which means it has already been built, because when there was the earthquake, the government built Amamumu for people to settle. After that, Kaleshi was built. There were estates. After that, Kanda was built. After that, Nyaneba was built. After that, Laboni was built. And so there was a process of building estates to house people who were not indigenous to Accra. That process ended when the military took over. And so from 1966, there has been a free for all. The question that I ask the researchers is that, how do we go back to actually change this? Because there's a party in Ghana now which says it's the property-owning democracy, and yet 95% of its members don't own any property. And yet that's the mantra that they play on. And yet people do not understand that in order for things to happen like it happens in this country, we need to have council houses being built by using the power of government. And yet we are lumped with IMF, World Bank policies, and also the kind of developmental ideas from the Earth Institute, which doesn't kind of understand what is actually happening in the undercurrents of the local people. I think what we have is a huge crisis in terms of our urbanization. Because there's globalizing at all levels. If you read Richard Grant's book, he's talking about urbanizing within these communities. And the government has no control, because there are non-governmental organizations just flying in and out of the place, even creating more confusion. Yeah. The point that I'm raising is that I think that is a lot more complex, and I think you've done a wonderful job.
So what you're suggesting is the most important part that I make in this project, is that those types of neighborhoods are considered legitimate by indigenous people in the city.
Yeah.
So they are legitimate places, they're politically recognized today, and landlords are able to serve a certain function and sell out land to people behind them. Places like Old Fadama, King Shona, Abuja, which are more squatter settlements today, are not considered legitimate by the broader community, which creates a certain type of landlord that serves as a de facto landlord, where they can sell it out, but they don't really have title, and they establish certain political connections in order to protect their power. Then you have areas like Gamashi, which a lot of people would say that's not a slum. Some people say it is a slum. The point is, it's an indigenous settlement that has lots of poor, overcrowded conditions. Choko and Shiabu, and those, the landlords are customary authorities who, it's run on families. And what I try to do in the project is explain that authority and even multi-party politics have to take those certain lines at the local level.
I have been working in Ghana over the last 5 years, dealing specifically on these issues, both with the Ministry of Local Government, with the various assemblies, as well as with community organisations. The point I want to make is, I absolutely agree that one has to understand the nature of local politics and how decisions are made to really understand how the city manages itself. But I think the issue in Ghana is, part of the crisis is that system simply doesn't make sense to the local people either. It's not a coherent system. So, for example, I was witness to a demolition of a completely formalized middle income area, where for literally decades people had invested their wealth into the building of 2-3-story buildings, where there's electricity, there's water, there's sewer, the whole thing. The military come and demolish that entire area.
And they're paying rates.
And they were paying rates in that area. You know, that goes beyond understanding of local politics. This has now become something, wow, what is happening in this country? So my point is, I think, and this is where I have a bit of a disagreement with you, on the whole I understood exactly what you were saying. There is an urban crisis in Accra. There is a fundamental urban crisis, and it's reflected in, for one of the most competitive African cities to have the lowest rate of sanitation in Africa, just by for a big city, to have some of the most polluted areas on earth in the city. The whole Lavender Hill, the whole area is literally the most polluted place on earth. It has more houses demolished than built. You know, this is all the symptoms of a crisis, and my point is, I'm not sure that understanding the local politics gives you the solution to that crisis. It gives you part of that solution, but it's not, I wouldn't overplay that, because I think this is a real crisis that the national government and role players have really got to come to terms with.
Thank you. Would you like to respond?
I mean, that's an important perspective that I think needs to be out there. I'm not trying to make a battle whether it is an urban crisis or it is a political opportunity or this is good or this is bad. I'm just simply, on the ground, in my experience, people saw these sorts of things as an opportunity in some way. So, I mean, you know, that's my only take. So, for example, something like the e-waste. When there's a big e-waste dump in Agboboshi outside of Old Fadama, and scrap dealing. If we see that as a crisis and we try to get rid of it, which for environmental reasons that would be good, there's also lots of livelihoods at stake. There's lots of politicking that goes on behind the scenes if you were to get rid of that. And that's what I'm trying to draw attention to.
I would say that, yeah, no, it's a good point. It does make Accra seem like a crisis, and the urbanization in Accra seem like a crisis. Sadly, Accra kind of has now become the theatre stage of Ghanaian politics, and the only way to convince your strongholds in the Volta region or the Ashanti region that you are working in their best interest is whether or not you are willing to defend and protect their relatives in Accra, or to, in some cases, not defend and protect your non-relatives in Accra, and that will perhaps explain why you may have something that is effectively a fully functioning town demolished on the whim of the military and perhaps one politician. It plays much more into the wider politics of the country and the message that they are trying to send out to their strongholds. And I think that will explain that.
Since 2009, with the single spine structure, you've seen a vast expansion of the public sector, but has there been any notable improvement in public sector, public services delivery in Accra as a result of all this spending all this money? I mean, I definitely, with the floods you had last year, which, I also get the impression that it's public services are not notably better in Accra than in other similar African countries, African cities, as I think another speaker mentioned.
Yeah, no, definitely. Sadly enough, the single spine salary structure has not had the effect it was supposed to. The argument is for a lot of people that it was perhaps just implemented too fast, too soon. And public services in Ghana and across Ghana. Actually, I might argue that it's better to be ill outside of Accra than it is to be inside of Accra. Let's be honest. The quality of the health clinics and the quality of the policing, definitely you don't want to be caught in the capital. And that's simply just because it was then manipulated as a kind of early electoral promise, and effectively a good idea that could be implemented over time was just utilised and manipulated to kind of give an early signal as to where the new strongholds will be for both parties, and who could sell the single spine salary structure as their idea rather than as just generally a policy that was necessary for the whole country. And so, yes, public services in Accra definitely would point to the idea that it is a crisis. I wouldn't know how we could argue to take advantage of it for any type of development. It does need a revisit. There are arguments to scrap it, and I would be in support of the idea, weirdly enough, because it's just had such a toll on the economy. The mismanagement has had such a toll on the economy that it doesn't seem to be contributing really in the way that it should be. I hope that does answer your question.
Could you perhaps just say a bit about single spine for people that who are not familiar?
I'm talking in terms that people...
well, it wasn't you. You didn't start.
People did. So the single spine salary structure effectively is a rationalisation of the salaries that the police, the fire service, the military, and the health service will be getting in Ghana. Before it used to be based on things such as your level, how long you have actually been in the job. Effectively, there are other criteria that people deemed unfair because it didn't really reflect performance. For instance, it didn't reflect. It just didn't look like a fair system, and it felt like many people were saying something that was reflective based on your proximity to the person who pays the piper, effectively the person who pays the payroll. And so the Kufuor government came in, they were there, and they decided that we would need to rationalise how the civil service, the public services were paid, with a single spine structure, which would tell you, despite, regardless of what job you are doing, when your next upgrade in your pay would be, and effectively it helps the government to forecast their economy for the next year, for the next 2, 3, 4, 20 years. But obviously we brought on a lot of people onto the system. The idea was that it would be gradually, you'd incorporate this section of the police and then this section of the nurses and this section of the fire service. And rather than doing that and getting there, we migrated almost everyone at one go. And that completely confused the forecasting that was left by the previous government. And the Mills government as well, how they forecasted when they first came in. And that's effectively what the impact it's had on the economy since.
But I just want to go back to I'm curious about these lower level political leaders, chiefs, bosses, how their legitimacy can be maintained in the face of our data from 2008 to 14. You have quite significant reversals in basic service delivery. So Julian mentioned about sanitation. But if you look at water somehow now has become almost wholly privatized. So while there's the Accra water utility, it's not really delivering much water to individuals. The individuals now are buying the most expensive water possible in sachets. And if you look at solid waste, virtually the state is exiting. And I'm just curious how the local leaders retain some sort of legitimacy, because if we think of basic services as one, you mentioned, as something that they can provide, our data is suggesting this is all going backwards. And I wonder, will this then disrupt politics as business as usual? So the economic macro issues at the big level, but when you get to the local ones, and we were just in Fidama the other week, I see this actually disrupting politics in a big way, because if you have the majority of the population urbanizing, and basic MMDAs not able to deliver, and actually now crumbling a bit,
Yeah, I mean, so definitely there's more pressure on these local leaders to act in sort of ways. So in a place like Old Fadama, they're forced to act privately. They're forced to establish their own, private toilets, their own water, and establish their own connections. And then they're accountable to a private select group of customers. I mean, I do think that the game has become more privatized, whereas in Ashima, where there is some element of formal assembly, you can work through the system a little more, and you're accountable to that broader section of the population because you have a formal title and you actually have resources from the state. Now, if you're not getting those resources from the state anymore, it puts a ton of pressure on these leaders to find different sources of funding, and they're forced to find alternative means. Now, does it really change the system? I haven't done before, after, when the privatization happened, and looked at how the dynamics changed. But I think this, looking back at the historical record in my research, all of these things were happening during colonialism. They happened during, Nkrumah's time. They happened during the military dictatorship. There's more pressure now on, obviously, the slum communities because there's more people and there's less resources to distribute. But there's similar politicking going on. There's similar sources of legitimacy. It's just that you're forced to find an alternative way to, to pay back to show your support to your constituents.
I would agree on that. I think in the case of a ruling government and a connection to the ruling government, obviously it would look like those services being withdrawn would affect an Alaji chief or boss, but effectively they will find another way, and their whole power is in showing that they can provide. It doesn't matter how or where that came from.
I'm intrigued by one sentence. In Latin America, there's a notorious man called Hernando de Soto, who argues that the answer to all problems is to give legal tenure to informal settlers. That will allow credit to flow from the banks, and the hidden capital will prosper, and that will lead to development. I believe this is nonsense. But I'm a little surprised to read in that context that you say insecure property rights provide the urban poor unique opportunities to start businesses, control housing markets, and govern resources and services. Now, you're right, but it produces that. I mean, Latin America, a settlement that old would have 2, 3, 4 stories, brick built, water provision services generally. So I'm a little stuck. I don't believe in Hernando de Soto, but I'm not sure your answer can explain that awful situation.
So, the insecure property rights in my reading of this contributes to this. Now, that doesn't mean that then secure property rights is going to bring us what we want. So that's the first important thing. Now, to me, I do think property rights are important, but it's not just a piece of paper and it's not just individual title. What it has to get at is these questions of legitimacy and a political agreement between the host city and the migrant communities. Because there are going to be winners and losers in this process. So if you have 80,000 people on a slum, if you formalize it all, my guess is people like Alhaji Chief, even the people who are affiliated with the NGOs are going to benefit because they have an incredible amount of power, and there's people who are quite powerless. Okay, if you displace them, they have nowhere to go, and there's 80,000 people. What do you do? There's going to be all sorts of resentment among the indigenous people of the city who feel like that their city is being taken over, whereas other parts of the country don't have this type of rapid urbanization. Now, this wouldn't be a problem if Accra, the Volta region, Ashanti, Kumasi, if all of these had these large-scale, urbanization processes where, it didn't matter that you were from this homeland. So I'm not suggesting that Hernando de Soto is right. In fact, I think the formalization is part of an embedded political environment. On the other hand, I do think property, where I think he is right, is that we have to pay attention to property rights. It's just that property rights means different things in different places due to different settlement patterns.
I do think with regards to that, the insecurity of property rights, the insecurity of land, is what keeps Ghana moving, sadly, or happily even. It is the energy behind Accra's, hustle and bustle when you get there and you like it. That's literally because of the hustle mentality. The government has actually tried to build, a formal town that, a whole kind of new wave of Tema building, effectively, in a town just beside in Sawam on the road towards Kumasi. But it's become stagnant. They've built another estate of that similar kind, trying to give the property rights and everything on the way to Adan, on the way to Pram Pram, and that's also become stagnant because I guess the slum politics that we're talking about works so well for what the people want. Forget that. Don't look at the picture. In terms of their experience of life, I guess is what I'm saying. Forget this. Don't look at the picture. Honestly, but effectively, the formalization is a slow, very very slow process, and it will naturally be rejected because of that. We're still waiting upon Hope City, and there's no hope in that city. So.